documentation of the society, given that the committee membership and the society itself were dominated by parents. What is notable is how the committee conceptualized parenthood, regardless of autistic children, as a problem, determining that, quote, a handicapped child means a handicapped family, end quote, resonates with mid-century discourse surrounding causation of autism. This stemmed from the writings of Bruno Bettelheim, who argued that refrigerator mothers caused autism in their child through neglectful and cold parenting, augmented by similar accusations levied by Leo Kanner in his pivotal 1943 paper describing infantile autism. The purpose of the early society then was undoubtedly to generate research and services which would support autistic children. However, the parents involved also sought to overturn their reputation and remedy the social and cultural challenges they faced in raising disabled children. And this was importantly conceived of by the parents as an independent issue to autism itself. This secondary mission was supported by academic literature at the time, such as George Stroh's article, Psychosis in Childhood, published in November 1962. In the subsection headed The Psychotic Family and His Child, Stroh asserts that interference with and limitation of the parent's own life arouses mixed feelings, which increases their already often present feeling of guilt for having produced such a child, end quote. The social experience of parenting an autistic child further features in this discourse, quote, neighbors complain or comment, grandparents or aunts and uncles criticize, end quote. It is difficult to infer the universality of this adversity from these sources, but the emergence of literature in the 1970s written by parents does attest to these social experiences. This literature was an expression and an affirmation, a continuation of the need for parents to legitimate their own struggles and only tangentially that of their autistic children. A 1968 review of Clara Claiborne Park's The Siege, detailing her motherhood of autistic daughter Ellie, commended Park for alerting us, quote, to the fact that we too must develop greater sensitivity to parents' feelings and needs, end quote. The parent-centered narrative permeated political and medical approaches to autism from the outset, encouraged by the work of the society. This is evident in the April 1965 report of the County Medical Officer of Health on services for psychotic children and their families, which suggests that, in the case of severely autistic children, quote, the whole family may feel excessive strain. Then the health of the whole family has to be considered, not just the handicapped child, and residential care may be necessary. Thus, conceiving of autism as a social and emotional problem of the family, extended beyond the psychiatric experience of the child themselves, was a key strategy of the society throughout the 1960s. The society established local branches across the country, and by 1964, there was a Northwestern organization led by Alan Pickard. Further research I have undertaken points towards the powerful and varied use of media sources by the society to spread awareness and apply political pressure, and this remained true at a local level. In June 1964, Pickard wrote an article in the Liverpool Echo, which further illustrates the strategy of autism advocates to propagate a parent-centered narrative. Is this your child? Pickard wrote, followed by a scenario. Here comes Neil, who breaks away from his mother's hand to snatch a tin from the shelf, which he sends spinning across the floor with amazing dexterity. Pickard details some other examples before asking, such naughty children, what are their parents thinking of? Well, their parents have quite a lot to think about, for these children are neither naughty or spoiled, they are autistic, end quote. By 1964, the emotional and uncaring image of parents of autistic children had begun to fall apart under medical research and scrutiny, but the appeal by the society to the common ground shared between themselves and parents of neurotypical children remained. Evoking similarities between parents before describing the differences between children remained a useful rhetorical tool in changing cultural attitudes towards autism. Politically, the same appeal stood. Mr. Compton Carr, who was a vocal advocate for autism services in Parliament in the 1960s, framed his argument in terms of parenthood. Quote, what parents must feel as a result of living with autistic children is unbelievable. One realizes that they are almost completely unpredictable and may be subject to great tantrums, prolonged fits of screaming and headbanging, and all kinds of peculiar behavior. That not only affects the parents and the parents in their relationship with the neighborhood, because, as one says, people talk, end quote. Having laid out the parent-centered narratives in the earlier stages of cultural, medical, and political awareness of autism, it is important to consider the repercussions of this approach. Deaf culture and history have relevant light to shed upon the disparities between parent advocacy and self-advocacy, where parental involvement has been overruled in favor of cultures and services shaped by deaf people. This history also intersects with LGBTQ+ histories, particularly that of stigma, which may be an interesting approach to both the experiences of parents and autistic people. self-advocacy in terms of autism has manifested itself through ideas surrounding neurodiversity, which has significant and far-reaching consequences for society as a whole. The moment of cultural and political dispersion in the early 1960s, led by parents, is a precursor to the neurodiversity movement. The history of disabilities, particularly of learning disabilities, has yet to receive the attention necessary to place autism history within a broader framework. The historical material exists to better understand special education, diagnosis, and the complicated relationship between parents and those they advocate for, and we have a responsibility to explore this further. Thank you.
Sorry, I had to quickly unmute myself. Fantastic, Charlotte. That was really very, very thought-provoking. And I think there's a lot in there, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I think one group of people that we often forget, who really are quite voiceless. I'm working on a project on children at the moment, and trying to find children's voices can be very difficult and challenging, can't it? So I'm sure people will want to talk more about that when we do the discussion. Okay, our next presenter is Isabel. And Isabel's going to be talking today about disease, blame, and contestation, Haitian American community mobilization and coalition building during HIV/AIDS. Okay, thank you, Isabel.
Perfect, thank you. Let me just share my screen quickly. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Isabel. First of all, just want to say a quick thank you to the organizers for all their hard work. Really happy to be here. My presentation is going to be disease, blame, and contestation, Haitian American community mobilization and coalition building during HIV/AIDS. So when we think about AIDS victims and AIDS activism, especially AIDS in the United States in the first decade of the epidemic, the 1980s and the 1990s, we tend to think of these sorts of images, or at least certainly I did. ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, the motto Silence Equals Death, led predominantly by young white gay men. The public memory of AIDS reinforces this, as do continuing AIDS media representations in film and TV. And what I hope to do today, at the very least, is to show you that although AIDS activism absolutely looked like this, it also looked like this. This is a photograph taken on April 20th, 1990, at a protest led by Haitian Americans in New York City. Haitian voices about AIDS have been relatively invisible. Anthropologist Michel Laguerre attributes their invisibility to their, quote, triple minority status. That is the fact that they were Black, foreign, and non-English speaking. And I think we can also add to that they were often poor and undocumented, and then it becomes more and more clear why their stories have not been told as frequently. There's also a lack of primary source documentation about Haitians, especially in English, which I've tried my best to work around. So briefly, some background about Haitians and AIDS. In November 1981, just a few months after a new and as yet unnamed disease was first reported, a number of Haitian immigrants in Florida and New York City were seen with characteristic infections. In 1982, the Centers for Disease Control reported 34 cases of the new illness in 5 states among Haitian patients. The majority of these patients denied homosexual activity or IV drug use and had never had a blood transfusion, unlike almost all other known cases at that time. This really stumped scientists, who seemingly never considered that a mixture of cultural taboo, uncertain immigration status, and language barriers might prevent the Haitians from telling the truth. In March 1983, the CDC referred to 4 high-risk groups for the first time. This was colloquially called the 4H Club, referring to homosexual, heroin user, Haitian, and hemophiliac, 4H, as you can see on the screen. And thus all Haitians were brought together and perceived as potential AIDS carriers. This designation was immediately controversial because Haitians were the only national group singled out. As Walter Dowdle, director of the CDC's Center for Infectious Disease, put it, quote, because of who they were rather than what they did. Both scientific and popular knowledge about the so-called Haitian connection was racist and anti-Haitian. Unsubstantiated theories which wrongly identified Haiti as the origin of AIDS, particularly theories which claimed that mysterious voodoo rituals or animal sacrifices were to blame, were given space in prestigious medical journals. These accusations had material consequences for Haitians living in the United States, who suffered severe stigma and discrimination. Haitian children were harassed and beaten up at school. Haitian-owned businesses failed, and Haitians were evicted and fired from their jobs, leading at one point to an unemployment rate double that of other Black workers. Activism led by the Haitian American community centered in New York City challenged the marginalization that the AIDS epidemic intensified in their lives. So the aims of my research, firstly, to begin to address the lack of scholarship and visibility on AIDS activism among Haitians, and specifically to consider the connections or lack thereof between Haitians and queer communities, as they both faced a deadly disease, government neglect, and widespread stigma. And doing this by examining one moment where they did not work together and one moment where they did. So the first event was a moment where the Haitian community self-consciously distanced themselves from the queer community, the 1990 blood ban protest. The Haitian community had mobilized throughout the 1980s in response to AIDS-related discrimination with varying levels of unity and success. But their strongest reaction was in response to the February 1990 FDA recommendation that all Haitians be banned from donating blood. Their movement culminated in an April 20th, 1990 rally where an estimated 50 to 80,000 people took to the streets, marching from Brooklyn to Manhattan and shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge for much of the day. So I'll play a short clip, about a minute, if it works.
Hi, Isabel. I don't think we can hear this, unfortunately.
Oh, you can't hear it? Ooh, no? Okay, fabulous. Save some time. Yeah, it's 15 minutes long, but it's really worth watching after if you have a second. So there's so many interesting things to discuss about this protest, but in just the interest of time, I'll keep it to a couple things. First of all, the Haitian community presented itself and this protest as unified. Attendance at the rally surpassed the expectations of both the organizers and police, and marchers were a hugely diverse group ranging from families to students. Yet this framing of unity and consensus was just that, a deliberate framing. The Haitian community in New York City was extremely heterogeneous in terms of class, color, language, immigration status, and politics, both at home and abroad. The issue of blood donation led to declarations of national pride, which could temporarily overcome these divisions. Protest signs read, "Proud to be Haitian" and "Proud of our blood." As a man says in the clip, quote, "We are one, we are proud of our people, the struggle of our people is just one." In this particular instance, the posture of the Haitian protesters precluded coalitions with queer organizations such as ACT UP, and indeed they self-consciously distanced themselves from the stigmatization of gay men in favor of developing coalitions with the African American community instead. And this choice makes sense for a variety of reasons. The fundamental issue at stake in this protest was challenging the national stigmatization of Haitians grounded in American racism, not challenging the stigmatization of those at risk due to their sexuality. Many of the protesters utilized the language of racial discrimination and racial justice. Signs read, quote, "AIDS is not racist, FDA is. USA, stop destroying the African race. Stop apartheid in the US and fight the power." Another sign that's worth examining read, "AIDS is behavioral, not racial." The implication, however subtle in this kind of language, was that those who practiced behaviors which did increase their risk of AIDS, such as IV drug use or anal sex, to some extent deserved their fate. As the young boy in the video said, "Don't blame the Haitians for what they do not do." It's important to note that even after the blood ban was lifted for Haitians, which did occur as this protest was successful, the blood ban still applied to those Haitians who used drugs or had sex with men. I'll now turn briefly to the Guantanamo Bay protest, during which Haitian and gay activists worked together as part of a broad coalition. After a military coup overthrew the democratically elected Haitian president Aristide in 1991, thousands of Haitians fled and headed for the US. Fearing an influx of refugees, the Bush administration circumvented international law, intercepted Haitians at sea before they arrived on American soil, and processed and detained the fleeing Haitians at Guantanamo Bay. Before the war on terror, Guantanamo Bay that we know today, some 300 Haitians who had credible fears of persecution so could not be deported back to Haiti were nevertheless refused entry and forcibly quarantined, some for over a year and a half because they had tested positive for HIV. 1987 legislation banned HIV positive migration into the US. Members of ACT UP and Haitian Americans, alongside a diverse group of activists, including human rights lawyers and students from Yale University, protested this detention throughout 1992 and 1993. The Haitian American community in New York was somewhat reluctant to support the detained Haitians, who tended to be young, poor, and darker skinned, and also were hesitant to draw public attention to the issue as they feared a reprisal of the stigma that they had faced earlier in the epidemic. ACT UP was similarly divided on the issue of the detainees. Generally, ACT UP did not reach out to Haitian communities, and often the loudest voices within the organization, white middle-class gay men, advocated a narrow focus on medication and domestic policy. Yet the early 1990s were a flexible time where ACT UP was broadening its focus and moving away from its initial motto of, quote, drugs into bodies. And thus ACT UP New York became involved in fighting the detention too. Neither community were unified, yet cross-cutting issues such as these invited expansive definitions of solidarity and innovative coalitions. So finally, some conclusions that can be drawn from this. Firstly, the connection between disease and blame now and then. We can see this now with coronavirus, and we could see it 30 years ago. Although disease does not perceive differences in race, class, or sexuality, in theory affecting everyone equally, it unfolds along the fault lines of society, amplifying and worsening existing divisions. Secondly, there's no such thing as a natural or easy solidarity. How communities and activists choose to build their movements and if and when to form coalitions depends on a variety of factors and often changes over time. We can see this with the Haitian American community. In 1990, coalitions with the African American community made more sense for the way that they wanted to frame their fight in terms of American racism. In 1992, ACT UP's focus was broadening. Haitians didn't have the widespread support on their own in the same ways they did during the blood ban, and thus they were able to come together. Thirdly, it's important to think critically about displays of community unity. There's no such thing as a homogeneous community, and displays of supposed unity risk overlooking internal differences and further marginalizing those community members who are seen as less worthy of support. And this applies as much to Haitian Americans as it does to the queer community now and then. And then finally, some caveats. It's important for me to acknowledge my own limits as a researcher, as a white person, as a non-Haitian, as a non-Creole speaker. Even where there is documentation, it's impossible for me to access these marginalized voices, and I can't pretend to do that. And also, I think it is possible that I'm overstating connections which ultimately weren't particularly important to either community or organization, who were each rightly focused on their own issues. Social movements can't and shouldn't address every injustice because that would be impossible. But as I think this quote from Brett Stockdale revealed, a mindfulness to the connections between communities and seemingly separate social problems is essential. He writes, "We must be attentive to what else is going on outside our particular areas of action because communities intersect and issues interlock. If we dig a bit deeper, we see that seemingly separate social problems are rooted in the same apparatus of injustice and exploitation. Coalitions that promote inclusivity and mindfulness of the interconnectedness of different oppressions are essential." That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. And I think you brought up important issues centered on nuance, which is so fundamental to when we understand and talk about history, because nuance is essential because so many people's experiences are so diverse. And also the question of intersectionality, which is, I think, we see in places like this conference, but perhaps we don't see so much in historical practice. So I think for, historians who are going to hopefully take all of our places when you graduate and do all your further studies, that you will bring this really important mindset to understanding history. And I think that's very vital and fundamental. So thank you very much. And finally, we have Megan, who's going to be talking about the never to be forgotten scourge, the forgotten victims of Spanish influenza and COVID-19.
Sorry, Megan, I just wanted to quickly interrupt to just quickly say, if anyone has any questions at any point, please just use the Q&A. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of the interface. You can ask these throughout the entire thing. You don't have to wait until the end to ask them. We will answer them at the end. But yeah, please do use that. Sorry to interrupt you, Megan. Carry on.
No, I was just going to say, please excuse me if I'm a little bit nervous, and I hope you can hear me. I'm going to hold my microphone, but please let me know if you can't hear me. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Here we are. Is that, can everyone see? Can everyone see? Lovely. So the Never to Be Forgotten Scourge, I've changed the title just slightly, but it's the victims of the 1918 to 19 influenza pandemic and COVID-19. Just before I begin, this presentation includes 2 descriptions of violent deaths and suicides, and I'll notify everyone before the descriptions occur. So if the description is something you don't want to listen to, please turn down the volume on the device that you are listening on. And then this little ear sign will appear on the top corner of the slide to notify you that the description is over and that you can tune back in. So let's get started. In recent months, the shocking parallels between the 1918 and to 1919 influenza pandemic and the exhaustingly inescapable ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic have been drawn in the news media, with many hearing of the 1918 pandemic for the first time. This presentation is a comparative exploration demonstrating the necessity of inclusive commemoration of the COVID-19 pandemic dead, first by locating the forgotten victims of the 1918 pandemic and arguably the forgotten pandemic in completion. A ceaselessly vicious cycle in all pandemics, the highest death rates and largest economic effects occur in the poorest and most disadvantaged demographic groups of society, who are forgotten in public health responses, fiscal protection schemes, and commemoration programs. So, in 2019, as a second-year history student who was taking a special interest in the history of medicine, like Anne Reid, I was shocked that I had never come across this pandemic before, and so I began my research. And here I find myself in another pandemic telling you all about it today. Very briefly, I have found that absence is determined by and indicative of a socio-political negotiation to forget, and this process can be found in the close examination of the few commemorative materials of the pandemic. My examination of the commemorative landscape, which I have decided includes any material monuments or behaviour created with the intent to remember, shows this absence. So this is quite a detailed outline of my research, but I'll keep it really brief. I'm looking at a collection of primary resources that are characterised by their disparate nature, and I'm investigating the boundaries between the public and private, which I believe evidences a complex relation between dissonance and disenfranchisement of grief, perpetuated by the state. The 1918 pandemic was experienced differently depending on identity, race, class, gender, location, previous health history, inequalities in healthcare systems, politics, and more. And I argue against the myth of a democratic killer flu, but rather the existence of deep social inequalities and inequities that furthered the mortality amongst the impoverished and marginalised, which continued after the pandemic due to the debilitating effect that influenza can have upon the body. The second wave, occurring in the autumn of 1918, was highly virulent, and during that year, Britain's death rate exceeded the birth rates for the first time since 1849. By the end of 1919, almost everyone across the globe had lost a friend, child, parent, or spouse on the battlefields, or to flu, or to both. The scale and velocity of death was and is unbelievable, and the rhetoric at the time and since was that it's just the flu. Does that sound hauntingly familiar? Death rates exhibited a distinct W shape, unprecedentedly primarily killing the young, and this is seen in the tiny graph just on the right. To some, the flu was ubiquitous and pervasive in nature, and the commemorative landscape and collective memory is characterized by paucity, amnesia, and absence. Integral to this discussion is the commemorative context in which the 1918 pandemic is situated, occurring at the intersection of multiple significant events in the early 20th century, and thus the pandemic is routinely subsumed within the broader scholarship of the Great War, further erasing the voices of those who have died from the flu. For those unfortunate people who died, death was extremely unpleasant and could be extremely rapid. I'm now going to quote from Dr. Basil Hood's diary, a doctor at the St Marylebone Infirmary who, during the pandemic, recorded the fate of the nurses who returned from the theatre of war to care for the sick at home. Please tune out now to avoid a graphic description of death from heliotrope cyanosis. One poor nurse, I remember, with terribly acute influenzal pneumonia, became so distressed that she could not stay in bed and insisted on being propped up against the wall until she was finally drowned in her profuse, thin, blood-stained sputum. Most died in their own beds without medical care, lips and cheeks bearing the telltale purple-black marks of heliotrope cyanosis, a condition that marked their final battle with influenza, as the lungs of young adults filled with choking fluids that starved them of oxygen. So, my research has shown that mortality rates in these groups was disproportionately high, And today I'm going to very briefly focus on 3 because I would love to tell you about all of them. And I'm going to talk about this in comparison to COVID in the UK. So first, occupation. Those who worked in overcrowded or enclosed settings such as mines, primarily in the East Midlands and the North, were more vulnerable to secondary infections which killed so many, and this had a large impact on the regional disparity of mortality rates. The pandemic also had a broader long-term impact on physiological health and socioeconomic health, as it heightened socio and economic dislocation. Perhaps 1 billion people suffered from influenza-related deaths, and that is without counting the long-term illnesses indicated by Niall Johnson that affected the central nervous system, and this is shown in the epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, an outburst of Parkinson's disease, and various nervous irregularities responsible for widespread schizophrenia, mental distraction, dizziness, and difficulties coping at work. This created flu remnants, those who were poorer due to the pandemic. Perhaps this is something that we will see with long COVID. The claim that influenza was responsible for more deaths than the unprecedented combat fatalities of the First World War has become a cliche. However, it is important to note that many deaths occurred after the pandemic due to the pandemic and have not been taken into account. So reporting at the time, gender, class and race ratios in death rates were overlooked, with discourses prioritising the commemoration of the heroes, the young, and this precipitated a pattern of disease discourse that has been continued throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. This was apparent in the disproportionate coverage afforded to the illness and deaths of serving police officers, health workers and soldiers. Sensationalist news reports of influenza-induced mania in the press obscured these statistics, which suggested that the urban poor were disproportionately at risk. In the East Midlands press, reports of desperate acts committed by those recovering from influenza in 1918 flooded the press. A high proportion of these involved cutting throats, so please tune out now to avoid graphic descriptions of violence and suicide. Mary Spowage killed her baby son by hitting him on the head with a hammer and then cutting his throat, whilst in Derbyshire, Mrs. Dorothy Fritz attempted to poison herself with carbolic acid. In a similar case, a man who recently, having recovered from influenza, attempted to cut the throats of his wife and 6 children before committing suicide. And these cases represent so many, there are just a few. In comparison to the pandemic, the commemoration of the First World War was state-sanctioned, which dictated who and what was remembered. Prevailing notions of sacrificial heroism legitimized the military dead. However, the influenza pandemic had subverted the narrative of sacrifice and medico-scientific progression, and thus was not sanctified or commemorated by the state. The work of Judith Butler illustrates how, in the context of war, certain lives are not considered alive, and thus the deaths are not grievable. The flu was a suspect rival to the real trauma of the war, as the flu dead could not be positioned as heroes or as sacrifices to a high ideal, and thusly their names do not appear on memorials. Ultimately, it was unpatriotic and humiliating to die of the war during the flu time. Until the 1918 centenary, historiographical work largely prioritized statistical data and disregarding the sound of the individual voice, especially those who are voiceless in the historical soundscape, compounding the conception of cultural phenomenological collective amnesia and thus vitiating the cultural significance of the biggest disaster in modern history. Now, this is a lot of text and I would really love to go into the historiography for you. It's my passion, but ultimately, in sum, the history grappled with the tangible and largely focused on the narratives of great men. So this is the aforementioned Dr. Basil Hood, who described his experience of the pandemic and provides the title of this presentation. A written contemporary account is rare, and what is most significant, however, is the memorialization behaviours Dr. Hood enacted upon the diary in the 1930s before he published his account. He added anecdotes and added adjectives to describe his nurses with the primary aim of commemorating his tireless medical staff who returned from the front line only to succumb from the flu. And this is the pandemic window. This is the second example in the 1918 to 1919 pandemic commemorative landscape I would like to talk to you about today. And every piece of writing on the pandemic states that there is no memorial to the pandemic in the UK. And it was a miracle that I found an obscure article online written by someone who had come across this window by themselves in this purely serendipitous moment that I found this window. Built in 2007, it's not easily accessible. It has no didactic or edutainment value, it has no plaque, and it is not immediately clear what the window represents. To a student of the pandemic, the blue and purple reflects the prominent features of the traumatic blue deaths I have previously mentioned. And also the line depicts the spike in influenza in 1918. I'm not sure if you can see the red mark, but that marks 1918. The window is one of 8 in a series and was not intended to be dedicated to the pandemic at all. It had to replace a medical chemical that quickly fell out of favor, and so you could say that this window is an afterthought. And it is dedicated to the medical staff who fought a war they knew they could not win. So kind of seeing these themes of medical valorization. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but I would love to talk to you about this. But COVID-19. As we feel the economic impact of COVID as a society at large, we must remember the legacy that long COVID will have on a person's socioeconomic health, akin to what we have seen in the 1918 pandemic. Furthermore, the subject of this conference, a recent report by Scope, a disability charity, has shown that 60% of people who die from coronavirus have a disability, and yet they only make up 17.2% of the study population. So I'm asking you, who will we remember and why will we remember them? Those who died of underlying conditions are no less valuable than those who work on the front line. As we cannot gather to mourn, democratic and accessible forms of commemoration are forming across social media platforms instead. And criticism levelled at the government for prioritising statistical data over the historical perspective supports my claim that we should be more inclusive with our remembrance, as pandemics are ceaselessly vicious cycles. Whilst the perceived amnesia of the 1918 Spanish flu is endemic to the West, it is not reflected across the globe, and this is a perception caused by the dominance of Western academia. For example, Yvonne Vera writes that in Zimbabwe, the flu in 1918 was commemorated through a matrilineal narrative instead, as the event was recalled in the names derivative of the word influenza, such as Fraser, and they were given to babies born as the generation that experienced the pandemic died, thus to continue the memory of the pandemic. We should take note and look outside of our limited and immediate commemorative culture when it comes to COVID-19. Perhaps my real question to you is, should we remember and are we going to remember? That's it.
Thank you, Megan. That was really very, very interesting. And I mean, I think that that's a really good question. So much memorialization is associated with war and wartime. We hear the Second World War coming up again. This is the pandemic we're facing is, similar to the challenges we had in the Second World War, which as a historian irritates me unbelievably. But I'd like to thank, while everyone's sort of thinking of their questions they might like to ask and formulating or their comments, for 3 excellent presentations. You brought in all kinds of interesting and connected sort of ways of thinking about health, power, regionality, and nuances. And I think that they're also all extremely important when we think about this. I wanted to just also say thank you very much for your excellent timekeeping skills, which would probably put most academics to shame. So thank you very, very much. That was very much appreciated. And I'd like to thank the organizers as well for doing such a great job. And I see Rohin's put up your a link to your clip, Isabel, in the chat, so that people can certainly look at that as well. So if we'll go to some questions, I mean, I have a million questions, but I'll let other people take a turn first. A question from Olivia for Isabel. And Olivia asks, have you come across any personal testimonies from queer Haitian Americans who felt ostracized from the Haitian American movement? And if not, do you think that there are ways in which we can rescue their stories from further marginalization?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's a really great question. And just, yeah, like the limits of time of my presentation, I think unfortunately made me paint like the Haitian American and queer communities as separate, which obviously they're not. And, obviously there are plenty of queer Haitians in the middle. There actually is one voice that comes through really clearly, which is great. A man named Asoto Saint, who is a gay Haitian man living in New York, who actually died of AIDS and was an AIDS activist. And he has a book, if you're interested, called Spells of a Voodoo Doll. I think really the only reason that his voice has kind of survived is because he was a really prominent artist and actor and poet, and so he'd left this kind of like literary and artistic legacy behind, like whereas most of the other people, most other queer Haitians don't have that. And he does speak about the ways that he kind of felt excluded in all kinds of movements, like excluded from the queer movement, excluded from the African American movement. He, I think, was like kicked out of his Haitian family's home. So I think there, there's certainly issues there about not being involved in the Haitian movement too.
Okay, we have a question emailed in from Megan. Do we see this pattern of ignoring death from disease when compared with death in combat prior to the First World War? Do you have any insight on that?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. There's kind of this inextricable link between disease and combat. Arguably, in some of our most famous wars, more people died from disease than they did from combat, whether it's some kind of trench disease, with malaria, lots of different things. Off the top of my head, this is quite embarrassing, but I can't think of anything specific for you right now. But primarily, I'm thinking of the Boer Wars, primarily in like the African region, that had a really high death rate due to disease. And a lot of these are not documented because it's embarrassing to say that your troops have died from disease when they should be strong men fighting for the countries. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Something for further research when you're looking to do some more work in this area, which is really fascinating. I have a question for Charlotte, actually, because I'm working on a project at the moment which is about children, so and assessment of children, so it's a much more contemporary project. And I was really fascinated by this understanding of these parent-centered narratives. And I was just wondering if within your research, you've been able to, of course, this is sort of making assumptions about what you've been able to do during this pandemic time. I wondered if this interest in regionality, I found the point you made, I thought that was really interesting. But I was wondering about the idea of the change over time, and if there were real points when you could say this was a significant change, or it was so spread out because of this issue of regionality.
Yeah, I think for a really long time, it was very, very much contained in London even. I would go as far as to say that, because partly because of where you had the clinic, so you have the Maudsley and the other hospitals that were sort of producing research at that time. The funding came from sources in London, and then these parents, all like the first parents who set up the society, all lived in like a mile of each other in North London. And I mean, for Michael Barron to have gone to Cumbria and for them to have not believed autism existed 30 years after the society was first established, you can kind of see that dispersion didn't really take place. I have done some work into trying to understand why that's the case, and it wasn't necessarily, when the goal was to improve services and to target sort of like national political bodies, the dispersion was almost not the main goal in those beginning stages. I think it probably isn't until the 90s when we first started to conceive of autism as being part of a spectrum, which didn't take place until the 90s. And more prevalent studies and better prevalent studies took place in the 90s as well, which meant that the number of children who were diagnosed with autism increased. And so as you get this clearer diagnostic criteria, it's easier to send out into sort of like the peripheries almost, if we were to use the center and peripheries models. So yeah, I would say the 90s is, if I were to pick a turning point, it is a bit more of a shift at that point as they get the tools to be able to handle things at a local level and to understand autism at a local level.
And do you think that parental support and representation is still fundamental for young people with autism or children with autism?
I definitely think it is still fundamental, but I think we see it with a lot of disabilities movements where it sort of begins with these gatekeepers, as you talked about at the beginning, of health and of diagnosis, so you have the medical professionals at the forefront. But I do think with all of the ongoing discussions and research into neurodiversity that maybe the role of parents is becoming a little bit lesser. And I think also it's understandable why parents are at the forefront at the very beginning, because they're the ones who are even sort of not discovering it, because obviously it existed before, but giving it a name and carrying out that research. And so for these first children, the parents of the society, their children were the first to be diagnosed with autism. And as we move further and further away from that historical moment, you have more research into autism as adults, which it wasn't even conceived of as something which adults could experience until like a lot later than the period that I've covered. So I do think parents still very much have a role to play, but I think that neurodiversity is definitely going to bring self-advocacy much more firmly at the forefront.
Okay. We have a question emailed in for you again, Charlotte. So it's like a test. Did the rise in awareness of autism cross over class? And the person says, were working class people more likely to be open-minded, or was this entirely the opposite? What's your research told you about that?
So my sort of research has definitely depended on what I could access in the National Archives on the 2 days I was allowed to go in. But it was a very, very middle class organization, self-confessedly as well. And I mean, they were able to establish the society and achieve success because they all had experience on other charities. They had experiences at university, they had the cultural capital, they had the connections in the media to be able to sort of make this society one which had political influence. And I think some of that does derive from their sort of middle class experiences. In terms of whether, I mean, people definitely experience disability and health differently based on class, for sure. It's so hard to locate sort of working class experiences of autism in the archives, like so difficult, because when they started, so when people were writing articles, when people were producing films about autism as you get into the 80s, it's still going into schools which parents had to somewhat fund. They had to, because everything was based in London. If you wanted to get a diagnosis, you had to travel to London. So obviously even that's expensive. So I probably would, and my research hasn't covered this, so this is just kind of, and there's been very little historical research into this anyway. So I wouldn't know for sure, but I have a feeling that quite often working class children wouldn't have been able to get the diagnosis. And if they did, they wouldn't have been able to access the services themselves.
Morrison, how much time have we got left? I'm mindful that you've all got a busy day ahead of you, so I'm just checking with you on the timing.
Well, because obviously we started a little bit later, we can carry on until 5 past, and then we'll sort of like interlude
Okay.
for a quick break. So if anyone has any other questions, oh well, carry on.
I have. This is what like when you get to be chair, it means you get to ask any question you feel like. So I was wondering if, because we've talked about working class and class in relation to Charlotte's work, I wondered if Megan and Isabel, that you would like to reflect also on class in the couple of minutes really that we have left. If you'd like to say something about that, because I think it was evident, obviously, that there are, and class is something, we're a bit, we don't necessarily talk too much about, or we might refer to it as identity or something else. So Megan, do you want to go first?
Yes, definitely. So within the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish flu, class was a huge indicator in the mortality statistics. There are rumors, I say rumors because I don't believe them, that the flu was democratic, that it killed across, it killed everyone. And it did, it killed everyone because there was nothing to be done about the flu. However, the susceptibility for flu was dependent on your personal health, your access to healthcare before. Within the two-tiered healthcare system, you either had healthcare because you could pay for a family doctor or you didn't. And like I mentioned, it was definitely placed on secondary infections susceptibility to secondary infections was based on your occupation, and overcrowded housing. And this was recognized at the time, but it was ignored because it wasn't an attractive topic. It didn't fit into the Whiggish progressive ideals. So there is a huge element of class within this, but it's not an attractive thing to talk about. And I think we definitely see that now within COVID.
Okay, thank you. Isabel, I know you also talked about, sort of because I mean, obviously class and intersectionality within all of these papers is very clear. And I wondered if you would like to say a little bit more about class.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a really important aspect of it. Yeah, worth mentioning. I think there's I don't know how accurate the statistic was, but an anthropologist in the 80s wrote that 70% of Haitian Americans in New York City were lower class. So obviously, yeah, you can see like that movement almost as a class movement. And then just because we're talking about the U.S. as well, like there's no universal health care. AIDS medication is extremely expensive. Most Haitian Americans were really alienated from mainstream medicine and like relied on their own kind of medical subcultures more so than like even public hospitals, which were expensive. And then class also, I think this is like beyond my scope also. We're thinking about how AIDS even now has really become like a class of the poor, and especially the globally poor. So it's like moved, it's still predominantly in the US and in the UK a disease of poor Black and brown people. And then as you move across the globe, like people in the global South are also, AIDS is a huge issue there as well.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully we're not too much over time. Again, thank you everyone for your answers, and thank you people for your questions and discussion. And I'm sure these discussions will continue outside this arena, as it were. And I wanted to wish you all the best with your work. You're all working in fascinating areas. It's wonderful to see. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And lots of people have said how interesting they found this session. So well done all around. I'll leave it to you now, Morrison.
Yeah, just sort of like concluding on what Julie was saying there. Thank you, Julie, for heading and chairing this, and thank you to our panelists for producing really, really interesting papers. Thank you to the audience for participating as well and your questions. Sorry for going over time a little bit, obviously started a little bit later, but we'll take a break now. Everyone can go off, have lunch, go to toilet, whatever. But if you're joining for the next panel, that will start at 1:25, and it's A Woman's World, chaired by Dr. Sarkar. And there's going to be some really, really interesting things there. So please do come along to that. Thank you all for participating, and I'll see you later.